roundtable discussion on political influence, lessons from policy theory. This is a panel of academics, and one of the jobs of academics is advancing and building knowledge. And of course we do this for the advancement of society also, hopefully making society better. And as academics, how we do this, we go around and we observe the world. We try to describe and explain what we see, and we try to describe these interactions we see, and try to make lessons and generalizations from that. And oftentimes when we think of that process, we call that essentially a theory. And so a lot of us, in fact, at this table here, we have gone through most of our careers so far in developing and advancing and creating these theories. Now we do this we're not just out there to pontificate. We're out there and actually using and developing these theories based on science and the rules of science. And we do our best to do this. And also there's not like a panel out there of like a bunch of godlike creatures that say this is good science or bad science. Science is actually determined, the quality of it, by actually a peer group. We send our papers to peer reviews through journals, and we'll review our papers. But as a result of that, we end up writing our papers actually for our peers. We actually write and speak a language that oftentimes academics can understand, but oftentimes students or people outside of academia have a hard time not understanding. And so part of the purpose of this, we have this panel today, but also a workshop we have going on right now, is to take some of these theories that they've been developed and to actually draw the lessons from them and practical implications. And I'll let the panel introduce themselves in a moment, and will be a few words. But in terms of like academia, I should back up too. My name is Chris Weible, and I'm a professor at the School of Public Affairs. And the School of Public Affairs is also a cool place because we do like a lot of this academic stuff where we develop theories, but we also do a lot of practice. We go through and try to reach out to the communities and try to do good in the world. And for this part of our School of Public Affairs, I want to bring it to Lisa Van Reemdonk and have her say a few words about the SPA Institute.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to stand up just because I'm not up there with you all. But so I'm Lisa Van Reemdonk, the new executive director of the School of Public Affairs Institute here. And I just wanted to add my welcome to you all. I know many of you, this feels like home because you're from here, and some of you've never been in this room before, so hopefully you'll come back. Our work at the Institute really, I like to say, sits at the intersection of the school and the practice communities, with the goal of really supporting this kind of work that Chris is describing, and building those and growing those strong connections between practice and academia. So if you enjoy today's conversation, I'd love to hear from you afterwards. If you have other ideas of how we can build stronger bridges between academic and practice partnerships, stop me, and love to hear about it. So, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Lisa. We're going to move on. And I'm going to pass it on to Paul, who will talk about this, with the special issue that this panel is contributing to, and the Journal Policy and Politics, which is also part of this effort.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Paul Cairney. I'm from the University of Stirling in Scotland. I'm Scottish. I'll be your Scottish representative today. I think that I'm hoping that'll let me get away with a lot of stuff. Yeah, now, also, I say that because I'm stalling a bit because my laptop just turned off. And all my notes are swimming away. So the basic idea of our collaborative effort is that we want to define and speak to an audience, like Chris says, that's not simply our peers. And, some of us speak to slightly different audiences, but they're largely, people who want to engage effectively in the policy process, or people in policymaking who want to think more about how to make that process better. And so we've decided amongst ourselves, the best way to do that in this kind of format is we need a language that's more accessible. We need to grab your attention very quickly because we know, normally you've got a captive audience. Normally you're sitting down here, you're hunkered down for a long PowerPoint presentation, right? But we want to grab your attention. So we all agreed that we're going to describe our insights to you in 3 minutes, no more than 3 minutes. I think we've got an honour system, but if there's anyone in the audience who wants to time and kind of shame each of us by staring, let's do that. Now, we've also, I think, come up with the idea that we're not going to tell you, we all sort of represent theories of some sort, but we're not going to tell you what those theories are. We are going to we maintain, at least for the next 30 minutes, that it doesn't matter what our theories are. It's the payoff that matters, right? So we're going to give you the payoff in 3 minutes. If you're interested, you can ask us more in the Q&A. If you're not interested, then I don't know what we'll do.
And on top of that, we're doing this a little bit backwards too. I would like to thank, first of all, School of Public Affairs and Paul Teske, who's providing some of the funding to bring some of these talented scholars to Denver, and also the Journal of Policy and Politics, who are also funding this effort and of just trying to draw some practical lessons from policy theory. So should we get started with this?
Yeah. We didn't decide the order, did we? I think it's a volunteer system.
Order that we went in today?
Oh, that would...
I think the new guy go first.
Okay. That's mean. That's
Apparently
kind of
I lost a
mean.
bet, so. Is that better? My paper with Serena Kim from Florida State University.
Will, introduce yourself, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. For those of you who, actually, a lot of people probably don't know me. I'm Will Swann. I'm a pretty new faculty member here at CU Denver. My research area is local government, public management, particularly focusing on urban sustainability and entrepreneurial behavior in local governments. Keep going. My paper with my co-author, Serena Kim from Florida State, focuses on a problem that's very common in public administration, kind of centralization versus decentralization. We just happen to focus on this problem in the context of metropolitan governance. Not to make a really bore you to death, but local governments, right? Fragmented local governments is particularly prevalent here in the United States, but also across the world. And fragmentation essentially creates externalities, policy spillovers that affect different jurisdictions, affect different organizations, right? And these can be positive or negative externalities, but nonetheless, those externalities are produced. This paper really focuses on how local government actors, but any policy actor in a fragmented governance arena can collaborate with other policy actors. So the first lesson we got from our paper was that really collaboration is difficult, and unless you can have expected visible gains and needs for collaboration, don't do it. It's difficult. But in the case where you can identify those gains and needs, the uncertainties of collaboration is really the biggest barrier. And how can you overcome that uncertainty? Well, identifying actors that you've previously collaborated with is probably the best way. Who have I worked with before? And should I work with them again? Other actors who may be similar to you. This is a concept known as homophily in the literature. Actors who are politically and demographically and even geographically similar tends to lower the uncertainty that's associated with collaboration. Picking the type of network strategy to use is really important, and it really depends on the maturity of the network and also the project itself. For larger projects, for smaller projects, whether you use a networking strategy for bonding, where you're trying to develop close ties between you and your collaborators, or you're using a bridging strategy where you're trying to get to those popular actors and get information and get legitimacy. And also political support and administrative capacity. Do you have that? Really, your collaboration is not going to be effective unless you do. Secondly, once you decide to collaborate, how do you do that and how do you sustain that? Well, using types of monitoring mechanisms, engaging in multilateral interlocal agreements appears to be a good strategy, particularly where you're dealing with higher level governments or lower level governments. Emphasizing building collaborative capacity is really important. So once you start to engage in collaboration, you're kind of building that network management skill and the leadership that you need to keep the collaboration going. Celebrating gains is really important. There's a really great example of Denver, Dr. Cog meeting here, where they're celebrating the gains, the regional gains from collaboration. So those are kind of some of the most important aspects of collaboration that we've kind of extracted from the literature. I don't want to go beyond my 3 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Sure, Will.
Hi, I'm Deserai. I'm an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs, and Mike and I are going to tag team. So why don't you introduce yourself too, and then we're sharing our 3 minutes, so this makes it even more Morden.
Right, it's going to be complicated. Mike Jones, Oregon State University School of Public Policy. So we were tasked, we study stories, we study narrative, and so everybody thinks they know what a narrative is. And so there's a theory behind this, which we're not supposed to talk about specifically, so we won't. But the gist of it is this. People think in stories. People communicate in stories. We call this homo narrans as a model of the individual. And eventually those stories become codified into law, into policies, and they become the reality that we have to live in. So if you look at something like crime, right, if the policy is that retribution as opposed to rehabilitation, there's a particular kind of story in there about the criminal, one that portrays the criminal as a victim and one that portrays the criminal as a villain. And these things become codified. So it makes sense then, if you can control the story, then you can control the universe. And our paper is going to show you how to do that. I'm not kidding.
No pressure.
So, no pressure here. So how we do this is we have a step-by-step instruction about how to know yourself, how to know your audience in terms of their belief systems, and how to establish congruence, and what switches to toggle back and forth in terms of characters, plots, settings, to manipulate or persuade, depends upon how you look at the term. And we walk you through that in the policy process, which Deserai will talk about. But remember, it teaches you how to master the universe.
Master the universe. So in attempting to understand how to master the universe, we first tackle in our paper who the actors are that might be actually constructing stories, right? So policy actors, elected officials, other decision makers, experts, policy analysts, scientists, and so forth, and then of course citizens, and then also the venues within which they may try to construct narratives to persuade or to influence policy outcomes. So in our paper, we present 7 different what we call intervention points, everything from media and social media narrative constructions to policy analysis to expert testimony and public comment, and also what organizations can do, what we call good faith actor assessments, where they can do an internal assessment to understand, are we communicating accurately to our own beliefs and our own organizational goals and mission, and who are our allies working in this arena that we might be able to collaborate with and work with to achieve our policy goals. Did I miss anything? All right. Excellent. That's us.
Well, I guess it's on me, huh?
Serena, introduce yourself real quick.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Sorry.
Hello, this is Serena Kim from Florida State University. I am working on the Institutional Collective Action Dilemma with William Swann.
Thanks. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Richard Simmons. I also work at the University of Stirling, same university as Paul, but we're in different faculties there, which gives us a good conversation sometimes about the way that the world works. I'd like you to imagine yourselves as policymakers. I'd like you to think about what that actually means. And I'd like you to think about, how do you actually decide what to do from within that space? And so in my work, what I'm doing is starting from the idea of institutions and the rules or norms that we accept as the way we do things around here, and saying that that's important. But I'm asking you how. How is it important for you as policymakers? How do institutions connect to your everyday lives? How do you carry them around in your heads? Do you actually do that even? And so I also want to change the focus a little bit and think about what you actually do and how that acts back onto institutions as well. So it's not just doing by learning from the institutions, it's also learning by doing. So there's various forms that what you do and how those things act back on each other can take. You could have some logics that emerge from institutions, quite abstractly, that guide you. But also there are action logics that you will employ that somehow might be explained by those in part. So I'd like to try and work a little bit harder to understand how those things connect, and how the institutional work that you do in interpreting those institutions feed into your action strategies as policymakers. And most of the times, these things are developing in tandem with one another. So while we can break them up perhaps and distinguish between them, in real life we probably need to find ways to connect them up together. So can we understand these things better? And what I'm working on in the paper for this symposium is a perspective that sees policymakers as orienteers. They're often called entrepreneurs. But I think that maybe overemphasizes the agency that you have. If you're imagining yourself still as policymakers, how much agency do you have? Are you an entrepreneur? Well, I'd like to characterize you as an entrepreneur, as an orienteer instead. If you don't have that agency, it's just hard work. You've got to get on with the graft of getting from A to B. So as a policy orienteer, what would you need? You'd need a map. You'd need a compass. But you'd also need a lot of energy to negotiate the terrain. You'd need adaptability so that you can overcome those kinds of hurdles and obstacles in your way as you try to negotiate that terrain. You'd also need to accept that not everybody is going to win that orienteering race over that course. But can you still do something good that meets your own personal objectives and moves the situation forward in other ways that are positive? So what I'm working on is how to build that kind of understanding of what we do and how we do it as policymakers. And I'm using theory as well to get to this. As I say, I'm not allowed to say what that theory actually is, but I'm trying to make a case that this theory actually provides us with a better way of understanding the task ahead of us. And I think the kinds of useful questions that this theory helps us to ask is, what do people actually do? Why do they do it? What are the reference points that they find useful as they try to make sense of their situation? Is it possible to find tools like a map or a compass to help them find their way better? What does that actually mean then in terms of what they actually end up doing? So from the perspective I'm coming from, I see the way forward as trying to build a map and try and use the compass to traverse the actual terrain that we're working in as policymakers. But I think an important point is that in the real world, the people who construct our maps for us aren't necessarily the people who have to traverse the policy terrain. And so where there's disconnects between these things, that can cause problems. Often the maps don't really work when you actually get out and you try to do something. Sometimes what you've learned from the institutions that guide you gives you a faulty compass. So you don't know what direction you're heading in. When you've got a bad map and a faulty compass, you're likely to get lost pretty easily. And as an orienteer, you're going to get pretty tired chasing around, not really knowing where you're going, tired, confused, cold. The sun starts setting on you. And you may be tempted to throw away the map and the compass entirely and just try and find your way forward on your own. So the task I'm setting for myself with the agenda for the paper I'm writing here is to think about better maps and a more reliable compass, so that what follows on are practical action strategies as people traverse this territory that maybe are helpful to them. Doesn't mean it's not hard work still. It's still very effortful. The process of orienteering is always going to be effortful and tiring. But at least if we can feel that we're moving towards the goal more effectively, then we might take some comfort from that. And so that just takes me back to institutions again and thinks about what sorts of institutional work are required. And if we're not getting the map that we need, what do we need to do? Do we need some cultural innovation? Do we need to do more policy work, as Colbatch might put it? Or do we need to do something more prosaic and closer to home and just think about what are the actual strategies we can employ day to day that would move us in the direction that a better map and a more reliable compass might point us? So that's what my paper's trying to achieve.
All right. Hi. I'm I'm Tanya Heikkila. I'm a professor here at the School of Public Affairs. And the paper that I'm working on is in collaboration with Krister Anderson, who's a professor at CU Boulder. He had another commitment today, so he couldn't join us. But Krister and I both are doing some work for this particular paper on trying to translate lessons from a body of literature that shall not be named. However, one of the leading thinkers in this body of literature had won a Nobel Prize at one point in time. So, but I still will not name the body of literature. But it was because of that. This was actually a very daunting, a daunting task for us. And what we were doing with this literature, which really focuses on institutions, is thinking about practical insights for policy design. And up until recently, most of my experience with policy design has been as an academic, has been a researcher. But a couple months ago, Dean Koski here asked me to serve as the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs. And I didn't realize what that meant, but one of the things that meant was I had to design a policy with a lot of help from others on our faculty tenure requirements. Okay, and we just voted on this. So I'm going to reflect on this a little as I give you some of the lessons that we've extracted from this literature. So I've had this experience as a policy designer. And so some of the lessons that come from the literature, first of all, when we think about policies, policies are sets of institutions. And by institutions, I'm not talking about brick and mortar buildings. I'm talking about sets of rules and norms and the things that we may not do. And so policies are these kind of complex bundles of these rules. And designing institutions and designing these policies is very difficult. It's hard to get people to, even sit down and agree that we should design a particular policy for a particular purpose. And designs don't often work very well. They don't often achieve the goals that we expect from them. So some of the things that we've learned from this literature include, how do we get people to sit down and come to some agreement to collectively act together on a new policy? So I was thinking about this in terms of tenure policy. Well, sometimes you have the hammer from upstairs, the provost telling you, you have to do this because your policy isn't working. But what the literature tells us is that actually one of the critical things we have to do is really build some social capital and build some trust amongst the people that are going to be engaged in this decision-making process. So one of the things you have to do is actually engage in face-to-face communication and allow for the people who are going to be affected by this policy to actually have some trust in the decision process. So I had to walk around and knock on faculty members' doors and sit down and say, hey, what do you think about the tenure policy? That's something that the literature tells us is critical for building, for overcoming some of these challenges to making policy. And we also have to realize that there's heterogeneity and inequalities in groups that make policy decisions, and we have to be able to realize that some people have more power. If I go down to a faculty member's office who is a junior faculty who isn't up for tenure yet, and they're looking at me, they're going to say, "Sure, Tanya, that sounds good," But we need to come up with ways for overcoming some of those inequalities so that people feel like they have an equal voice in those processes. And so skilled leaders who have adequate levels of trusted information can help. Whether or not I was a skilled leader in that process is still open for debate because I'm pretty new at this. Then we have to figure out, well, when we design these institutions, do they work? And so there's some insights from this literature that says, hey, here's some of the things that might work when you design it. Here's some of the things that you need to consider. We need to make sure that that there's incentive compatibility between the design and the targeted behaviors. So if we design a tenure policy that says we want people to publish 20 articles a year, or let's say 5 articles a year, the incentive for that may actually push people to go publish in really crappy journals, right? And that's not what we wanted. We want people to be publishing in good journals. So we need to think about how the tool and the rule that we're establishing is going to affect behavior. And there's a lot of good research from this body of literature on how you can measure that and assess that. We also need to acknowledge that certain rules can disincentivize people from having autonomy or having kind of self-governing capacity. And so if we take out some of the autonomy, the flexibility, say, that our academics have to pursue their own research agenda. They're just going to go pursue something that's very narrow, that they've just been told that's what you have to pursue. That's not the type of policy we want. So thinking about kind of incentivizing policies to ensure for self-governing capacity and autonomy is really important. We also need to ensure that we have policies that allow for effective monitoring, conflict resolution, and linkages across different scales of decision-making. And finally, this literature that I'm working within provides this framework that once we have a policy in place, it can provide some diagnostic tools that we can use to unpack the design of policy and look at it in terms of what are the different kind of situations where we're trying to govern behavior. Is it just around, how people produce articles as academics, in the case that I'm talking about? Or is it also about how we engage with each other as a community of scholars, going to conferences, going to, having events like this? And how do we incentivize particular types of behaviors in different types of situations? And there's lessons from this framework on that, and I'm not going to get into the details because I'm out of time, but that's what we've learned.
Okay, thank you. So, I don't know if I should follow Tanya's lead and say, my author sounds very much like Jingdon, and I'll be talking, I'll be talking about multiple beams. Right, okay, I didn't tell you anything there. Right, so, we were also thinking about, ideally we want something like six-word titles, right? So we're mucking about, and I think I went for Chrissy's one, and mostly a joke, but I'm running with this. So my title is 3 Habits of Successful Policy Entrepreneurs. Okay, so I too want you to imagine something. So imagine you know something about the world and you're looking for some kind of policy response to it. So imagine you're like a scientist. You've got some evidence. You think it's important. You want policymakers to do something with it, but you don't know much about policy theory or the policy process, right? So what can we tell you? If you come to us, what kind of advice would we give? So the answer is learn from policy entrepreneurs. So, broadly speaking, these are the people, elected policymakers or unelected influencers with the knowledge, power, tenacity, and luck to be able to exploit windows of opportunity. Right? Now, window of opportunity describes 3 things that come together at the same time. Attention rises to a policy problem, a feasible solution is already available, and policymakers have the motive to select it. So entrepreneurs know that they need to exploit these opportunities. But they don't wait for this opportunity. They promote it or they grab it, right? So how do they do it? In 3 ways, right? So they draw on 3 rules, 2 of which seem counterintuitive. And the third one, I'm going to really kind of murder with terrible metaphors, right? So the first one, counterintuitive one, don't focus on bombarding policymakers with evidence. That is often the sort of intuitive response by scientists. If they're not listening to what I'm talking about, they must need more information, more evidence. Instead, people are put off with too much information. They want to process and understand things as quickly and as easily as possible. So entrepreneurs tell a good story. Maybe they don't, control the world, but they grab the audience's interest, and then the audience demands information. So they withhold information. They tell them just enough for them to be interested enough to ask for more. So that's the key. So instead of trying to focus on the supply of evidence, you're trying to encourage the demand. The second thing they do is they realize that by the time people pay attention to a policy problem, it's too late to come up with a solution. So what they do is they produce their solution and then wait for the right time to chase a problem. And the third thing they do is they recognize when your environment changes, your strategy changes. So let me give you a couple of examples. So a lot of the focus on this original Bingdon focus is the U.S. federal level, right? So you imagine at the U.S. federal level, you're effectively in a sea of people and organizations, and you're a surfer waiting for the big wave. That's your environment. That's your opportunity. If you're in a smaller subnational level, maybe on an issue that's far lower attention, more lower budget, you're talking about a small number of streams, and you can be Poseidon moving these streams. Okay, so you're trying to recognize the nature of your environment and adapting to it. Sometimes you can be a small player, sometimes a big player. Again, at the US federal level, you think, right, there's so many people involved, there's so many opinions, so many interests, you need to soften up your solutions, and that takes time. That can take a decade or two to get enough support from enough actors to this policy solution that you keep changing. In subnational areas or in other countries, you have much more opportunity to import and adapt ready-made solutions that don't have to be softened in the same way. So again, you're looking for the nature of your environment and the opportunities that come up. So it all adds up to one simple piece of advice, which is timing and luck matters, but policy entrepreneurs know how to influence that timing and help create their own luck.
Okay. I'm going to actually try to time myself. But before I do that, I'm not going to ask you to imagine policymaking right now, because for some of you, it might in fact be a nightmare. But rather, what I'm going to do is, I'm interested, Sam, oh, right, sorry. Yeah, I'm Chris Koski. I'm at Reed College. I wrote a paper with Sam Workman. We're really interested in how it is that governments make better decisions. I think, like a lot of other folks here at the conference, we understand that governments themselves are often mischaracterized as not having enough information. And in fact, we know that's not true. There's not really a deficit of information that governments face, but rather a surfeit of information that they have. At the same time, though, governments actually, they may have a lot of information, but it may not, in fact, be the correct information. So governments try to solve this problem often by governments, or I don't care if they're federal government, state legislature, city councils, they try to solve this problem by delegating authority to deal with very specific issues. And in delegating that authority, they do a couple of things. They first of all, of course, delegate authority, which creates a different set of very narrow filters on the types of information that to those delegated agencies or delegated entities. But they also focus attention away. They create an attention focus specifically within those agencies. So when governments delegate authority, what they're really doing is delegating attention. We think that, a lot of policy scholars think that attention itself is one of the main driving forces for policy change. There's some differences of opinion, of course, across the theories that you know about where the sort of the focus of information is in thinking about trying to motivate policy change. Some folks will tell you that you need to understand the belief structure of the individuals or a belief structure of coalitions. You might want to develop tools by which you might want to try to influence or persuade or change how it is that people think. And those are good theories. There are other theories, however, such as the one that we're dealing with, which suggest actually that, you know, when policymaking comes, when the wave comes, usually you don't have a lot of opportunity to think about or change somebody's beliefs. When attention shifts to something, people make decisions based upon the existing information they have. And so we have the entities that are ultimately delegated authority, or these sort of subunits within these broader units that are delegated authority, themselves are subject to the same kinds of limitations that force the sort of superstructure, the above institution, to delegate the authority out, which is that there's a narrow capacity, definite attention capacity, attention zero sum, and also that there's a limited capacity to process. So the challenge, of course, is that there's this trade-off between delegating this authority to these sort of delegating authority and also trying to coordinate the information that comes back from the delegated authority. And as a result, often what happens is that because everybody's subject to these cognitive constraints and capacity, et cetera, even though you've attempted to try to create more information and create a more broader information search for similar kinds of policy problems, you ultimately get the same kind of status quo bias, even though you've delegated. So you get stuck in a rut. So what do you do? Well, one of the things that folks tend to think about when there are these problems associated with trying to coordinate a series of different information sources, or if they see that some agency has been captured by some interest, is to simply centralize authority. Because the argument goes that the status quo bias within a subgovernmental unit is one that results from an incomplete information search. And that's partially true. However, the centralization bias, or the centralization fallacy, to use a term that appears in Mike and Deserai's paper, the centralization fallacy, however, simply subjects the institution that centralizes to the same kinds of forces, the same kinds of attention limitation forces as would be the case in the narrowly focused unit. However, it also has to deal with a series of other issues. So the problem there is, yes, you do gain some coordination gains, but at the same time, you lose the information search. So we proposed 3 solutions. We've decided that 3 within this panel is actually the optimal number for solutions. So we've decided that we proposed 3 solutions associated with this. And generally speaking, these solutions fall underneath this argument that we might call adaptive governance. I'm not sure if this is a Trump moment where I just said prime the pump is something I invented or not, but I'm just going to call it adaptive government. The one thing we can do is, of course, design institutions not just to attend to problems, but to specifically be information seeking. So we, of course, know that when we design an institution, we give it a set of goals. It focuses on those kinds of goals. At the same time, we can mandate that those institutions actually look for certain kinds of information. And a good example of this might be something like NEPA, right, which requires that any federal agency actually conduct, at least say that this is not going to impact the environment, much less create some kind of environmental impact statement. Also, agencies themselves need to listen to the information that delegated units give them. So when delegated units come to similar conclusions, even though they're looking at different information streams, that's an important signal to the institution above those delegated agencies that there's actually quite a bit of an agreement. Disagreement amongst those delegated agencies, however, is also a good signal that there's some disagreement or that there is some kind of disharmony in the information search. Sometimes when institutions see that their delegated agencies are disagreeing with one another, they will simply discount either public participation in the process that created the disagreement or just simply discount the outlier opinions. That's really bad news for public policy. And the third thing is that we propose that the issue bundling allows for these kind of institutions to make sense of all the information that's flowing up from those delegated units. So for example, if you create the issue, if you tell agencies to examine the issue of climate change, the USDA will examine climate change much differently than, let's say, the EPA might or the Department of Transportation. And even though they're working with different sources of information, different stakeholders that are sort of informing maybe sort of different worldviews regarding climate change, the institution itself, in this case Congress, will at least be able to make sense of a lot of that disparate information along the same stream of information coming forward through issue bundling. So hopefully, ultimately, we hope that this produces a better way that governments can make decisions and process information going forward.
Thank you, Chris. Again, I'm Chris Weible. I'm a professor at the School of Public Affairs. And before I begin, I'd like to first acknowledge a couple authors and contributors to this workshop who are here. That's Claire Dunlop and Claudio Radiali. Both of them are at the University of Exeter. Is that right? Good. And they're just unable to make it. They are participating remotely. Another is my co-author on my paper, and that's Cairney from the University of Bern, and she could not be here either. For my kind of theme or topic, I want you to just imagine yourself as, citizen, and let's say you have a gripe about something in your community. Could be something related to, let's say, could be oil and gas development, let's say in Colorado. Could be something related to school choice. Maybe you're an advocate for, medical marijuana or legalization of marijuana or not. And the question is, what do you do? And you could, if you wanted to, let's say, give money or participate in a political party, let's say, support a candidate. And then that's a viable option, actually. But oftentimes, political parties are kind of, they support various platforms, and sometimes they don't support particular issues. They're very broad, and oftentimes they focus more on elections, at least as they relate to us, citizens. Another option might be just to kind of maybe form or jump into a social movement. We often see social movements like the civil rights movement as an example, but often those are kind of societal wide. Oftentimes they last for a while, but they kind of go away, and it's kind of hard to just start one just by yourself. Like, they're not always around. They're not always on the issues we care about. You might look out for an interest group, let's say, and maybe you can find them online. Maybe you can give money to them, and maybe you can volunteer sometimes. That's another way to do it. That's also very viable. Nothing wrong with that at all. But another way that Karen and I wrote about, and that is just to kind of scan the landscape and look for basically these ideas of kind of coalitions, these advocacy coalitions that are in our society and in any open democratic society, especially in high conflict situations, but situations where there's gripes like you might have. And these are very kind of, it's kind of funny. They're not like, you won't find a website that really advertises for a coalition. They're kind of formed around kind of core values that you might share. And in fact, those people might have the same gripes. You might find people in government. You might find people in the private sector or the nonprofit sector. You might find some scientists. You might find some people in the media in these coalitions. And if you think about these coalitions, you might ask, well, how can I come involved with one? And these coalitions, actually, there's generalizable forms. There's people like different roles that they play, different positions. And sometimes there's these really principal members who are kind of very stable. They're always there. Oftentimes they're the ones in the government agencies or the interest groups, and they they're stable. And there's other people who are just kind of come in and out. They're like the collaborators who aren't always collaborating, but they come in when they need to come in. Maybe when a policy is being pursued in legislature or not. Other times, like, you might not even want to be an advocate. You might just say, you know what, I'm tired of all the conflict. I'm tired of people just fighting about issue X. There's other people in these coalitions or in these issues that aren't even part of coalitions. They're actually kind of brokers, and their primary objective is to kind of reduce the conflict, bring peace or consensus. And there's other groups of people that are just kind of like leaders, like some people would call them the entrepreneurs. There's another kind of role you can play. But there's, and then finally, like sometimes you just might want to be a citizen and just kind of jump into these coalitions, like, at a protest or write a letter or whatnot. And there's roles as kind of citizens in these groups too. They're more like a political resource. You might be called upon when needed. And the point is that, in a democracy like ours, there's multiple ways you can get involved. And there's not just through political parties, not just through like becoming members of this one interest group or joining a social movement. There's this other kind of coalitional concept out there that you can use to your advantage if you want. And finally, I'd just like to say on this coalitional concept and influence, because that's what you want to do. You want to influence the system. There's no silver bullet, so to speak, of how to do this. There's no easy way to do it. We don't know what an effective coalition is, just like we don't know what an effective interest group or social movement. We have factors associated with it. We could say, well, the odds will increase in your favor if you do these things. All I would say for now, and we do expand upon this now in the paper, is that what you can do is join like a coalition or something, because you won't be successful alone. You need to have some sort of alliance. If you do that, you'll increase your odds. And I'll end on that. Well, I'm like the last one.
Yeah.
All right, so now it's time for you guys to ask really hard questions to the audience, and Daniel Koski will be the man with the mic. And there's a question.
Koski 1, 2.
How do you differentiate the social movement from the advocacy coalitions?
So basically, a lot of times social movements, in fact, they overlap, I would say. Social movements actually emerge around, usually at the societal level. Often they emerge on very general themed kind of topics like civil rights or women's rights movements. Oftentimes they end once those issues become institutionalized, so to speak, once they adopt a policy. Oftentimes those social movements go away or they lose their momentum once that happens. Coalitions as a concept often starts after when the social movements end. You can think of it that way. So once you get like the policies adopted, the coalitions are the ones that kind of maintain and keep it going, keep updating it, adjusting it over time. But in a way, like if you look at the pure definition of a social movement versus like a coalition, they're very much the same. Although you will see coalitions at much more the local and like subnational level. And social movements usually, like I said, usually are at the national level. So in a way, they're kind of like a national level coalition trying to get something on the agenda.
Thank you. Dr. Swann, this one's for you. And I'm sorry, what was your name again? Serena. Okay, Dr. Serena? Okay. So when you're talking about collective action, one of the things that you said is that collaboration, one of the ways collaboration works is if you work with the same people over again. So how does that, so when you're thinking about entrepreneurial spirit or new ideas to solve new problems, how do you deal with that situation if you're going to have a collective action movement and you have the same people there all the time?
The short answer is we don't really know. I'll address it first, and I guess I'll throw it to Serena. But we do talk about that in the paper, and I think that we have to think about it somewhat, simplify it, and think about it at if we're at the stage where we're trying to identify collaborators, right? If we're working with folks that we've worked with before, right? We can be more assured through reciprocity, through a history of relations, right? That organization is going to come through. But I think you're absolutely right. I think those greater gains to the collaborative advantage that Huxham and Van talk about, right, can really be achieved by the bridging the structural holes that Ron Burke talks about, right, where you're tapping into networks and you're tapping into groups that you don't normally collaborate with. You're not collaborating with homogenous actors, right? You're collaborating with ones that are heterogeneous. You're collaborating with ones you don't usually collaborate. I think the higher hanging fruit is actually precisely where you said it is. So, the short answer, I think, is that we don't know precisely how to do that yet, and the empirics haven't gotten that far. But theoretically, that's kind of my suspicion. But do you have any?
Yeah. Just one thing I need to correct is that I'm a PhD student at Florida State University, so you can just call me Serena. So, yeah, and I think the new information is kind of the one of the most challenging thing that constitute the barriers of the collaboration. Actually, that the many institutional collective action, the literature addresses if there are some difficulties of collecting this information, it is really important to design the institutions which can reduce the monitoring and information costs. And I think one of the things that we talked in the morning that Professor Cairney actually talked about, when the new information is very difficult to gather and also very limited. So in that situation, it is very easy to be manipulated. The situation can be very easy to be manipulated. So, in order to maintain those agreements and prevent those possibility of the defection, those enforcement and monitoring is also very important. Yeah, so that is my answer.
So this is kind of a broad question. I'm thinking, so I just taught this class in political economy and policy analysis, right? And on the flip side of policy, when you're analyzing did it work or how did it work, there's a reasonably agreed upon set of economic criteria, right? And not the only ones necessarily, but certainly economic efficiency and notions of redistribution or equity in whether policy worked well or not. But on the policy process side, we've just heard at least 5 different theories that are different slices, different emphasis, different actors, different approach. Is there potentially any hope for a unified theory of the policy process? And short of that, we have the one that masters the world. I know that masters the universe. But short of that, because that is probably unrealistic because it's pretty darn complicated, do you feel like your theories speak to each other? Do you learn at the edges from one another, incorporate it? Is that a way towards a unified theory, or just stronger separate notions that PhD students have to understand for their preliminary exams?
I'll jump in real quick just because I think this is one of the things I've enjoyed about today's workshop and hopefully tomorrow as well, is that in going through this exercise, I've already identified a number of ways in which these theories speak to one another. We talked about the important task for Paul and Chris and their job as editors of this issue to try to identify those overlaps. So, for example, in the theory we're working with that helps you master the universe, one of the interventions that we discuss in effective storytelling and understanding whether or not the stories you tell are true to the beliefs that your organization holds, or and being able to then identify allies and other actors might map onto a theory that Chris might be using in understanding who those allies are in the policy realm that you're working in. So I think we've been having some of those discussions, and I think that's one of the really interesting things about a lot of special issues try to dig into one theory very deeply, different facets of one theory. And I've enjoyed this exercise because it's kind of forcing us to do some of that, which I think unfortunately happens too seldom.
Just to piggyback and just to mention, I think this is the talking about the practical implication. It is really important to, I think it is important to cut down these jargons and just explain the findings in the terms of layman's. So learning from other theories and explain our framework's finding with other theories term was actually very useful and helpful for us too. So for example, in explaining the collaborative barriers, how does the learning process can help us to overcome those collaborative barriers? How can the reflective learning and bargaining learning could enhance the capacity of overcoming collaborative barriers like that? So I think not completely, but there are possibility to just adapt other framework and other theories findings with the findings of ours.
Can I say, in terms of a unifying theory, my sense on that is that it probably isn't possible. And even if we tried to find one, I'm not sure how desirable it would be, because I think actually one of the things I want to absolutely support what my colleagues have said about how useful this workshop has been in terms of realising how similar the things that we're all saying are. There are some real similarities there. But one of the advantages of that, I think, is in then cherishing the diversity of these approaches as well, because they do all go into depth on things that are really important in their own right. And so connecting them is really important, and I think this issue can do that really well. But actually keeping the purchase that each one of these theories gives is also really important to continue to cherish that.
Well, I think, just to add on to that, I think that's also because each of these theories tackles a different question. They're not all tackling the same question, like what is the policy process? So we can't have a unified theory around that. They're tackling questions around, how do people solve collective action problems? There's some overlap there. Or how do people influence policy processes? What are the mechanisms for making policy processes more reflective of your interest, for example? There's some of those questions get asked. Other questions might get asked around what are the opportunities or windows that open up, that allow for us to take advantage of policy change places. So there's just different questions that we're tackling, and there's some overlap amongst the questions and ways that we can talk to each other. But I wouldn't want a unified theory.
No, well, I was going to say, there's that theory going around that our world is just a computer program. And I call it a movie. It's called Matrix. Well, yeah, it goes back, doesn't it? It goes back. Go back. But I think that would confirm it. If one of us came up with this unified theory, I think that's it. Okay. But I think the next best thing. So Tanya and I have this double act every couple of years, which is a chapter on theories of policy process, and I think we describe the next best thing, which is there are a couple of things that all of the theories try and describe in different ways. And so it would come down to the first thing, policymaker psychology. So I think that's almost all of them are saying, you can't, no one can process anything but a tiny proportion of their world. So they're looking for ways to deal with that. So I mean, that's a theme that goes through everything. We do emphasize different things, but I think there is a real overlap. So with, I don't know, we can talk about what we call these things now. So I think, with punctuated equilibrium, multiple streams, there's a real overlap about, this is about agenda. Yeah, big reveal. And then, then there's stuff about, what habits do people use, and are they good or bad, or, what stories do people tell to exploit these biases? So that seems to be a I think that's as close as we get. The second thing, I think, is a bit more of a stretch, but you say, right, well, this all takes place in a really sort of complicated policy environment. And we can't quite describe what that is, but we can say, look out for 5 things. Now, I think we disagree on the number. I mean, I've given up. In the book, it's 6, right? Well, I say it's 5, right? 5. And those 5 are, we're trying to capture. There are many actors at many levels, types of government. So therefore, you have to pay attention to lots of different people and lots of venues. Each venue has its own rules that you have to understand, and it can take a lifetime to understand some of the rules because they're not written down. Each venue might have its own rules about creating networks. Who do they speak to, who do they not speak to, and what information do they gather? Each venue or subsystem has its own sort of way of thinking, or there's a kind of language that dominates in which you have to adapt. So I guess that would be the kind of economic thing, would be there are some places where you have to speak an economic language to get anywhere. And if the final 1 or 2, I think, is, I would say, socioeconomic conditions. You have to account for the effect of these things that are often outside of the control of policymakers, but we have to interpret and adapt to them. So we call those 5 things an environment, and we say boundedly rational policymakers engage in that environment. And I think that's the closest we'll get.
I want to comment on that too, and students who've taken my class may remember this also. I think in the New York Times, a few years ago, articles came out that basically said that higher education is not teaching our students to think critically. It was kind of like a crisis in critical thinking. And in fact, we talked about that in one of our faculty meetings a few years ago. And it got me thinking, what is critical thinking? And what does it mean to be a critical thinker? And if you look at critical thinking, and I can't recall all the points, but are things like questioning your assumptions, or the assumptions you see. Things like asking questions and different types of questions. Things like don't taking things for granted. There's a whole list. I think there were 7 lists. And I looked at that list, and before that, I had a list in my syllabus about why I asked students to learn multiple theories, and I matched that almost completely, just by accident. And I realized that basically one of the challenges, especially with social science in particular, one particular approach, economics is maybe one, I don't want to pick on it too much, but when it becomes so dominant, and that's your one view, there's 2 errors in kind of human minds. One is a theory of error of kind of theory of tenacity, where basically you stick to a theory even when you see disconfirming evidence. The second is theory confirmation, when you look for just basically confirming evidence out in the world to confirm that theory. And we have a tendency to do this as humans. We want to stick to our gut assumptions about what works in the world. And the only way you can guard against that is to learn multiple perspectives. And if we did have one, if we did not teach others well, we're prone to basically really limit ourselves in terms of how we understand the phenomenon we're looking at. And that's one of the things I think is really vibrant about the policy field, is that there is multiple perspectives. And it guards us and actually moves us forward in terms of understanding the world, making sure our science is the best it can be. The challenge, of course, is the siloization, which is also good about workshops like this or the theories book, because it brings these theories together and actually enables them to speak to each other.
I'd like to chime in as well, because I think I offer maybe an alternate perspective than the rest of the table. I would say this: when we look at the purpose of public policy, it is to what? It's to control our social environment. That's why public policy is made. We make laws, we pass laws, we create programs because we have some set of expectations about what the future will bring. That's important. It's not necessarily concerned about pedagogy or even critical thinking. It's not a stroll through an art shop where we're looking at various paintings, appreciating the nuance. I mean, we're talking about programs that literally kill people or allow them to live well, or be educated or not. And I will tell you this, from my perspective, all of the theories and frameworks at this table are lacking because none of them predict at all. Maybe a little bit, in very sort of mundane, banal kinds of ways. The closest we get is economics, which is why I think it's dominant. And so when we have these sorts of conversations, and I think the sort of mantra in the field is to throw our hands up and say, it's really complicated, and let's appreciate the diversity. Okay, we can pat ourselves on the back for having such a diverse collection of theories, but what do they do besides provide entertainment about what happens? what do they tell us about what will happen? And I think that's a strong argument for finding unified theory, for looking at those intersections and developing something that could help us with those really critical, important social problems. That's my 2 cents.
Other questions?
I have a question. Ominous voice. So what other theories or general concepts do you think may not be represented in the panel or through the papers that were written for this special edition that should be given some sort of platform?
I'd say there's nothing on social construction policy design, and I think that does add something in terms of, that really focuses the minds on, I think your starting point would be, there's a real temptation of policymakers to build policies on stereotypes of populations, and so here's how you can respond. So there are real practical lessons, I think, that engage with really kind of timely issues. That one's gone, I think. And I guess a kind of related one would be sort of anything that talks about, actually, I think in the US we talk about policy feedback theory. I'm still not used to that. I think I'm used to calling that historical institutionalism or new institutionalism or something like that. I think we don't have that, but
say diffusion of innovation.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
can I? The cool question, Daniel, I think also is like what are you trying to kind of show, or what's the objective? And I think of the objectives. Well, we want to influence, let's say, essentially the political system in society. And then I think that the panels is an artificial construction of what's out there. And there's loads of stuff out there. There's really interesting theories of political parties. And if you want to influence politics, you got to understand political parties. Really interesting theories about how our courts work. Social movement theory, huge.
There's a really interesting theory of policy conflict, too.
And there's one of policy conflict, too.
Good plug.
Never get funded.
Never get funded.
But one of my main gripes of the policy field, and I think if you look at, again, it's kind of students in my class with experiences too, it's gradually just getting broader and broader to include more and more political science, sociology, and everything else. I think all these theories are in the Theories of the Policy Process book that I edit, and that book is often used to design and structure syllabi. That's good, that's useful. At the same time, it really artificially kind of strains the learning that really should go on among the students and among everyone in terms of how we understand the system. And there's some partitions in academia that are useful because we need to simplify things and organize stuff. But in terms of like providing practical advice and everything else, it's really just it's unfortunate, actually.
I'll add something that's a little bit unrelated, but at the same time, I guess we're on the same page. I'm not sure about a theory that's missing necessarily, but I think when a lot of people approach public policy, they approach a particular area of public policy. So they're interested in like environmental policy or transportation policy or food policy, something like that. And in the policy process literature, generally speaking, I think we try to keep ourselves above that. We try to keep ourselves, many of us work in a lot of different policy areas. So I work on climate adaptation policy and climate change policy, and I also work on food policy and all that other stuff. But at the same time, I wouldn't consider myself a substantive expert necessarily in those things. Whereas I think most people, particularly practitioners, that's what they do. They're interested in a lot of the substantive depth associated with it. So to the extent that we can add anything to that conversation, we can add kind of this broad process perspective that we hope can apply to all of these very specific institutions or specific venues. But ultimately, one of the challenges I think for our discipline, really bridging the gap between sort of the process approach and how people actually implement it, is that most people live for a specific policy, a substantive policy type, rather than living for sort of the process itself.
You've mentioned a couple times being kind of a scientist, like when you're studying or writing these things, acting as scientists. But I'm kind of, this question for everyone. how you view your role as a researcher and how that might affect your work or the way that you think it may or may not be applicable to the kinds of things you're trying to change. One example is when I hear a scientist is, kind of a disengaged, kind of objective, kind of just trying to describe what's actually happening. Or are some of you kind of trying to be engaged scholar practitioners, or so what your role is as a scholar as you do this research?
Start down there, Will. You're going to answer.
I guess I will say I try to be as absolutely objective as possible. I wouldn't venture to say that I could possibly take all my biases out and none of it's in my work. I just don't know if that's possible for any human being, even the natural scientists. But I think as I view my role as viewing things objectively, I think that just gives our work more validity. But I certainly don't share. I mean, there may be different opinions here, but that's my view.
Yeah, I mean, I would say from my own approach to my work, I've typically taken the posture of a social scientist trying to understand the world around us and how it works well and how it doesn't, how it fails us, how it helps us. But one of the things that I really enjoy about being at the School of Public Affairs is there's this encouraged interface with the practice and with our community. And so I've taken not a ton of opportunities yet, but a couple of strategic opportunities that align with my own work to help an organization try to understand what they're doing and whether or not it's responsive to what we know about that area from the scholarly perspective. And that's been a lot of fun, feeling like, okay, this knowledge that I'm aware of, and I have the luxury of having the time to explore and the freedom to explore as an academic, that I can then hopefully help someone do their job in a more effective way to meet their organizational mission. So that's been something new for me and something I've really enjoyed in the past year since I've been down here.
For myself, I've always been bothered by the word objective. I'm not sure I believe such a thing exists, and that we all operate from this position of subjectivity. And we interpret information, we pass information along in very biased ways. So I don't think we can ever remove our biases. I think when we say objective, what I think of are transparent. And if it's going to appear to mirror that definition, then you're relatively disinterested in the outcome. Bored, probably. I don't like to be bored when I do my research. So I tend to focus on things that have sort of that subjective tilt to it. Beyond that, there's kind of a tension imbued in the profession that I think Laswell passed to us, and that we're social scientists, but then also sort of champions of democracy on some front, maybe even doctors of democracy. So on the back burner, we have to be concerned with that, and the very fact that this field exists is kind of speaks truth to that, right? Because it's policy process, and we definitely have a bias in what kind of processes we prefer, I think, and whether or not those processes are healthy. Some might say pluralistic is healthy, others might be more critical of that kind of role, but there's definitely bias in what we do, and I struggle with this. In fact, we'd have this conversation with this very panel quite a bit today. Where do we cross the line and become advocates when we're talking about taking these theories and making them actionable for practitioners? I don't know that I've found a comfortable answer to that question yet, so I'm just going to stop talking now.
I'm not sure if I can answer a discussion or not, but just I think as a policy researcher, my role is just to help the citizens do their analysis, because actually I don't know much about the very expertise area, and there are plenty of people who knows the substantive area much more than I do. So if they want to if they want something to happen, then we can say in these social circumstances or in this institutional design, it might work, but it might not work. Just we can suggest some things could be happen or something might not be happen like that. So just I think my role is just suggesting some kind of implication from the history. That is one of the role, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I agree with most of what everyone else has said so far. But on top of that, I would say that as a researcher, I work in a school of applied social science, and again, I'm privileged to be able to then work at the interface with people in the real world rather than just sit in my office all day. It is a privilege, and I think one of the things for me is that you get very grounded in what people are saying, but you also get the chance to sense check, the findings from your research that way, and being able to sense check it with them is a real advantage. It gets sense checked in various ways. So it gets sense checked through the process, but also when we arrive tentatively at some kind of decision or some kind of something that emerges from that research, then it gives us a chance to test that out. And through publication as well, I often, I've made it kind of a purpose of mine, really, when I finish research, I will go for academic papers, but I will also try always to work with some kind of organisation who will publish some kind of practice paper or something that's relevant for their practice audience. And I think that engaging with that process sharpens your findings as well and helps to sense check that. Just in the process of putting that publication together, your message gets tightened and kind of what you're delivering for people, I think, gets sharpened that way. In terms of the extension of that, my research has, I've been very lucky to actually have a spin-out company that's come out from one of my research projects where I'm actually involved in directly in policy making and sort of directly in trying to influence policy making in a particular area. And that's been really eye-opening for me as a researcher to then stand on the other side as well and see exactly how policymakers respond and the kind of things that make me a successful policy entrepreneur, if you like, not as an academic or as an expert, but as just a regular person.
Yeah, I'll also agree with what's been said and just add that, in an applied social science program that I'm in, there are these great opportunities to do this kind of engaged scholarship. I still try to adhere to some basic rules of science, and those rules of science allow me, hopefully, to do work in a transparent way and in a way that provides some impartiality to my research. But I engage in this research because I'm passionate about some of the questions, the important public policy questions that I study. I'm interested in cooperation, I'm interested in conflict, I'm interested in environmental governance issues, and as these are things that are important to me, and hopefully some of the lessons that I've learned can inform policymakers, and that I can also learn from them about how to better refine my research. I try to do practical kind of lessons learned from each of my research projects that I can share in different ways, whether it's through reports or through training programs that I've done with practitioners on how to engage better in conflict processes or collaboration, or whether it's bringing it into my classroom where I have students who are master's students out working in public agencies, grappling with these problems every day. So, I think there's ways to do both, and it's hard to be objective, as Mike said at times, but I think following the rules of science can help you with your research, but it still needs to be grounded.
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a scientist to annoy real scientists. I'm a scientist too, sort of thing, and I think it does annoy some. But I suppose I'd like to describe this road to Damascus. I don't know. I say this knowing that maybe I'd have to explain that, right? But my name is Paul, right? So I've seen the light. So I started off. There you go. So enough people got that. So I started off, I think, very much along the lines of, I only study the policy process. I find it interesting. It's nothing to do with me what you do with it, and no one's interested in what I've got to say anyway. And and that was true then, but I think I found that that's not true anymore. And there are these opportunities that come up. And I think they're increasingly important. So the sort of things I was describing, I do speak to scientists with no knowledge of policy making who do describe an anxiety about politics, that they don't understand it, they think there's something wrong with it, and they don't know how to engage. And there is, policy theory, I think, does help people. It either gives them, simple skills, or it gives them a comforting message about why the world doesn't work the way we would like it to. Okay, so it's not their fault. But there are other things. I mean, if this was 5 years down the line, I think I would give a different paper, which is on sort of diffusion and transfer. Because what I'm about to do is start off with this proposition, I think, that's quite popular, at least in Europe, about co-production. So you can either co-produce knowledge with practitioners and policymakers, or co-produce policy with policymakers. And I don't think it doesn't really mean much, but it's good kind of trendy topic. And but I sort of maintain that if we were serious about this as academics, then the way we co-produce is we speak to policymakers at the start of our research. We ask them what at the end of it, what they'll be interested in, and that influences our research design. Because instead of finishing the research, then giving them a kind of knowledge translation, we build what they're interested in into the research design. And I think that is the way in which we can engage routinely. But it does raise these ethical questions, I think, because so the example I would give is looking at how to reduce inequalities in society. Now, I suspect what I'll find when I speak to lots of governments is they'll say, right, I'm not interested in redistribution. I'm only interested in what you can tell me about these individualized projects that build up resilience in people. And there's a real dilemma there, isn't there, about, should you just accept what they're interested in and go along with it, even though you're not sure that's the right thing, or should you try and influence them as you're gathering this research? And I don't know, maybe you're trained, maybe do you teach an ethics class or something like that? We certainly, I don't offer it. But these are the big kind of ethical questions that I don't think we know the answer to.
Okay, a couple of things. It's interesting, we're all having this kind of tension about whether we should offer advice or not, which is exactly what real scientists do. So I feel like, in fact, we are kind of like real scientists, even though we have an adjective in front of it, like political. But there's a couple things that you're kind of faced with as a policy scholar. I live in Portland, Oregon. You're familiar with it. There's a show. And there are maybe, I was just trying to count in my head how many policy scholars there are in the city of Portland, and there are 4. And there might be, I don't know, how many you have at OSU? About 4 OSU, and then maybe 4 again at University of Oregon, maybe, right? So that's 12 for the entire state of Oregon. So when the Oregon newspaper wants to have ask a question about something related to, let's say, our fluoridation debate, which we had, whether to fluoridate water, and of course the city of Portland decided to not do that, which is very strange to me. The local reporters call me and they say, "What do you think about this fluoridation?" And this was my first year at Reed, and I said, "I don't know anything about that policy." And then I hung up the phone, and my colleague in political science, who studies American politics broadly speaking, gave them a quote, which was, anything that any of us could have given. Like, well, it seems like a really important issue to Portlanders, and that was it. And so it seems to me that people are going to ask us for information or ask our opinion about these kinds of issues, often as a function of just because we have the expertise. And again, it's no different from asking, people with PhDs in science, broadly speaking, about something like climate change, even though they might not study climate change. Well, you're a scientist, you must know something about it. So one of the things I hope to do, if you want my opinion about something, I will definitely give it to you, but I'll also, of course, try to be informed. But there's another side of this that's ethically, I think, challenging, and that is that, and this, again, comes to this notion that Mike brings up about how we, in general, like democracy. That is to say, we normatively are in favor of this concept of democracy, in part because that's the way we view the policy process. We view that as a good thing. We also view there to be certain processes, or rather, we understand how certain processes work. We have a lot of assumptions about those processes, and sometimes we're faced with, sometimes we're faced with leadership or political movements that frankly are just wrong. And it's hard for us, I think the challenge for us as policy, the challenge for me has been how to approach that in a way that doesn't sound biased, even though I know it's just simply wrong. Now, I teach at a liberal arts college, liberal arts college, so it's not a real challenge for me necessarily, but I think a lot of folks are struggling with what to do. It's not just the normative aspect of whether democracy is a good thing and we got to preserve it, but also, when somebody issues some kind of makes a statement like, for example, they're going to engage the regulatory process in a way that cannot happen. It's just challenging for you to approach that from a perspective that doesn't seem as though you're out to get the person who said that. You're not. You just understand that to be fundamentally wrong.
I'm just going to add a few points. One, if we think of the policy process as this kind of a term we use to describe how, let's say, policies are essentially, adopted and implemented in our country, or any country for that matter, it's continuous. There's loads of decisions along the way. And as scholars, we can participate at any point in time and maybe throw a pebble in the stream. And it may affect it may not a little bit. But we don't know if we're at the point when things really change or not. We just don't know. But we do know, we can throw things in. The question is, how do you most likely influence the direction of that? And one thing I think as academics we downplay enough, because I do think we can get this flow from the source. And we do that through people. We do that through teaching. And what we don't emphasize enough is that basically we have students in our program who will jump into that policy process and they can affect it. And how can we affect them? We can actually give them the best information we can about the literature. And through that, they can make the best decisions. And they'll be in this process 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And that's our best hope for influence as, I think, researchers. And not only the people we teach, it's the people outside of our academia, outside of our particular institution that really matter. So this particular special issue involves a lot of theories. Many of the same theories you'll see in the theories of the policy process, the book that a lot of PhD students read. I think that those theories have become so sophisticated, they are almost inaccessible to master's and undergraduate students. And a lot of people aren't teaching. I don't know if I would recommend it to undergraduates. It's too much. But what this special issue with these papers are ideally for is people that are at the undergraduate and master's level who need basically, this is the main points you need to know. And hopefully these theories and the knowledge in them will become accessible to them. Hopefully they'll go out and do good work and do it for years into the future. I think that's more than any of us as individuals can do. Okay, we only have 2 minutes. Any final words? Well, first off, please join me and first of all, thank, I guess, everyone for showing up and participating in this roundtable discussion. And in particular, I want to thank the people from out of town. Paul Cairney, Scotland, Richard Simmons, Scotland, Serena, Florida, Mike, Oregon, and Chris, Oregon. Sorry, I kind of skipped you there. And I thank everybody in the audience. We have people come down from Boulder and from elsewhere in the state. Thank you for coming. And we'll be hanging out in just a couple minutes if you have a few questions. So again, thank you for sharing your time with us.